Welcome to Lesson 14 by Chess Achieves. In this lesson we're going to talk about 5 key principles that are focused around controlling the center 4 squares of the board. Those center 4 squares are D4, D5, E4, E5. Controlling those central 4 squares is like controlling the elevator shaft in a very tall building. The elevator is a quick way to get up and down to the different floors of the building. If you're using the sides of the board, it's like taking the stairs. It takes longer, it takes a lot more turns in order to be able to control space. So the 5 key principles that we're going to talk about today are control the center, knights before bishops, castling your king to safety, don't get your queen out too early, try to connect the rooks together. So to continue with item number 1, we want to look at controlling center space with the E-file and D-file pawns. You might call them the ED pawns. The ED pawns, by going towards the center of the board, starting with an E-file pawn, allow an open line for the bishop on the F-file and the queen on the D-file to see lines out. This is probably the most common opening in chess, starting with E4. The black army in this particular example is going to make a series of poor moves, just moving its pawn in an uncoordinated effort to continue the game. The white army might continue by pushing the D-file pawn to the center to take a firm control of the center 4 squares, being the E4, E5, D4, D5 squares. Black army again makes an uncoordinated effort, just simply moving a pawn. The white army will continue by developing its knights before bishops. This is the second item we talked about. Knights help control 2 of the center squares when they move towards the center. In this example, we developed our knight to F3, very common place for the knight, helping control the center squares. The white army continues on after its next move by developing the bishop to C4. In this example, by moving the bishop, it allows the opportunity for castling. Castling is the third thing that we're going to be looking to do in our activities, in our checklist for starting a game and getting a good foundation going. So castling your king to safety is something you should be very focused on in the first 5 to 10 moves of the game. We continue on by developing our other knight to continue to control those center 4 squares. Developing the bishop, also putting pressure on one of the center 4 squares. Something you don't want to do at the beginning of the game is get your queen out too early. If your queen gets out too early, it can easily be pushed around by your opponent, allowing them to threaten it in many ways. While they're developing their pieces, you're simply moving the same piece around. So a basic concept in the opening is to try not to move the same piece twice. Sometimes you'll have to, based on an attack that your opponent's presented, but you should look to avoid moving the same piece twice in the beginning. It just loses time and you're not developing any more pieces. And if your opponent is developing pieces, it's an advantage for them. So try not to move the same piece twice at the beginning of the game. So, if we're not going to get our queen out too early, you're looking just to move the queen up into one of the center squares slightly above it, either D2, D3, E2, E3. The rooks like to be connected together. In this case, the A1 and the F1 rook can see each other along a straight line. If the rooks are to try to change and travel up a file, the rooks would then again want to connect together so that they can push together. The rooks like to be able to stay connected. We've completed the first elements of our game. These are the foundations of opening. Controlling center space. Developing knights before bishops to again put more pressure on that center space. not getting the queen out too early to avoid being pushed around by our opponent's pieces, keeping our rooks linked together, getting our king castled to safety. At the beginning of the game, you should be focused less on attacking your opponent and more on developing your pieces. If you're not in any danger, focus on developing your pieces. You do have to watch out for threats from your opponent. If your opponent does get their queen out early, you have to think danger. That is a threat. But in general, getting your queen out and attacking with it early will, in the long run, result in negative consequences for the army that developed their queen early. But you do have to respect the queen and the attack that it can bring by being developed early. So now let's take a moment to look at a more balanced game with two players with more experience. Again, the white army always goes first in chess. They'll start with that center pawn to e4. Black counters with e5. The white army brings the knight out to attack the e5 pawn. Black army, not wanting to lose control of the center, might defend it with knight to c6. Game continues on with the Ruy Lopez. This is probably one of the most common openings in chess. The bishop comes out to b5, putting pressure on the knight. One of the most common defenses to the Ruy Lopez is Morphy's defense, and he says, "Get out of my house," by attacking the bishop with the a6 pawn. The white army has a couple of choices now. If the white army is to capture the knight, the black army has to respond by capturing back with the pawn on d6. This opens up the queen. Now it may look like when the knight was removed, the white army could come up and capture the e5 pawn. And this looks like a big advantage for the white army here early on in the game. However, the queen can now come up and fork the knight and the pawn. Not wanting to lose the knight may drop back. The queen takes the pawn in the center, gaining some center control. The white army will defend its king that was in check by interposing with the queen. Queen takes queen. King takes queen. And now that the white army has moved its king, it's lost the ability to castle its king to safety. So the black army has removed the opportunity to do one of the 5 key things that we talk about in this lesson, castling your king to safety. It will take extra turns for the white army now to be able to castle its king manually by bringing the rook over, dropping the king down into the slot. This would have an advantage for the black army in this particular case. But the Ruy Lopez is a very powerful opening. There are plenty of books specifically about the Ruy Lopez and many of the variations that can happen early on in the game. But this was a more balanced approach where both armies were playing for center control and trying to make opportunities in the beginning of the game. We've looked at Scholar's Mate a little early in our lesson series. It bears repeating, as many novice tournament players will lose to Scholar's Mate early on, or some variation of Scholar's Mate. Again, when your opponent develops their queen early, you have to think danger. In the long run, this is not going to be a good move. But in the short run, you have to respect the power of the queen. So here we have the white pawn coming out in the center, seemingly normal opening here. Notice the bishop came out and attacked the pawn on the f7 square for the black army. That's the weakest pawn for the black army, as the f2 pawn is the weakest pawn for the white army, as only the kings can defend those pawns. Black can continue normal play. Black comes out and defended center pawn. Now, the queen came out very early in the game. You have to think danger here. There are 2 attackers on the f7 square. A player that's not paying attention may develop his knight, attacking the queen, thinking he's going to push the queen away, but unfortunately this led to what's called Scholar's Mate, a very quick way to create checkmate on your opponent, because they didn't guard the f7 square. Going back 2 moves, the black army should have recognized the 2 attackers on the F7 square and simply brought an additional defender to help protect the square. Now there's 2 defenders, 2 attackers. Defenders win ties. The game could have continued with the knight being developed for the white army. Now the black army can pressure the white queen away and develop its knight to the square that it wanted to go to. So in this manner, the white army will now start losing tempo because he's moving the same piece twice in the opening. Be on the lookout for that bishop-queen combination on either the F7 or the F2 square early on in the game. Many new tournament players will fall prey to this opening with some experienced players. As a recap for today, the beginning of the game is about developing your pieces and controlling center space. Try not to move the same piece twice. Try not to focus on controlling the sides of the board. Focus on controlling those central 4 squares. Develop your pieces, develop all of your pieces before you start attacking your opponent. Watch out for your opponent to develop their queen early or opportunities for them to attack you with their queen early. These are things you must be on the lookout for. So again, the 5 key principles in the first 5 to 10 moves of the game. Control the center. Knights developing towards the middle of the board before bishops, because knights help control more of the central squares. Castle your king to safety. Don't get your queen out too early. Try to get rooks on open files. Open files are where both pawns in the same file are missing. If you don't have access to an open file, try to put both rooks on one of the central files. Those are the things you should be focused on before attacking your opponent. Quick attacks, if your opponent stops them early on, usually result in a negative aspect for the attacker that was in a hurry to start attacking their opponent early on in the game. Chess is about using combinations. Bringing your entire army to the attack will generally result in better foundational play.